Hey, and welcome to another Revit Tools video. In this video we're covering dimensions. In the Annotate tab you can see there's 9 different types of dimensions that you might deal with in Revit. And this is going to be a 3-part series where in each video I cover 3 different of the dimension types and go over the different properties and where you might use it, and hopefully give you a comprehensive guide on dimensions after the 3 videos. So this will be part 1. And I'll cover the aligned, the linear, and angular dimension. So I've got a basic floor plan here once again, and I've got a few different dimensions laid out here, and I want to take these dimensions and start to play with the different properties that we have with the aligned, linear, and angular types. What I want to do now is I will select this dimension, and you can see I'm in a basic template, a just default Revit template. I've done nothing special with it. And at this point, I've got just the basic 3/32 aerial linear type. And the first thing you will notice actually is I used the aligned dimension type to draw this, but I'm getting a linear dimension style. And as well as if I were to have drawn this with the linear dimension tool, I would have also gotten the linear dimension style. So something to be aware of in the beginning, whether you're using the aligned or linear dimension tool, you're going to be dealing with the same type, which is a linear dimension. Either way, they're linear, whether they're end up being aligned or used in the linear. That's something to be aware of. It's very helpful that they're actually the same, because the point is you want your dimensions to appear the same and function the same, and you're achieving that through the type properties. Let's now look at the type properties of this basic linear dimension style. As you can see, there's a lot here, and I am going to go over probably 90% of these, and I'll attempt to do this very quickly. So right now the dimension string type is continuous, and by continuous it means I can continue to draw sections of dimension strings. So if I go to aligned and I tab to the finish face there, I now am prompted to continue this, and at this point now I'll select that, and now I have the same dimension string that I can continue to add pieces to and strings to. I could take this to infinity. I can have one long dimension string that covers the entire length of the drawing, and that's perfect. Most of the time you're going to want to keep your dimensions that way. Now if I were to take that from continuous to baseline or ordinate, I can hit apply, and now I only get one string. You can see I had 2 strings here, and now I just have 1. I will hit cancel and undo that. I'll go back into that type, change this to ordinate. I'll hit apply, and again, it's just I'm getting these dimensions displayed on either end, which this is bizarre. I've actually never really used this at all, and it's just saying that from the length, one length here to one length there is this length. So basically I'm starting from one side of the dimension to the other. So at this point it's 0. There's no length from this point to this point. Then I get to this dimension string, and that's one length, which is the 37, and then the entire length is this final element there. It's kind of a mess. There may be times you might want to use this if you want to display a specific measurement, or drawing a line and the lengths of line at specific segment points. I don't know. Again, I've never used that. I'll just put back on continuous. This is what you're going to be familiar with. And then leader type, arc. I will show you a leader. If I were to drag this dimension, this line is considered a leader, because I could drag this dimension across the entire screen. I could put it somewhere else in the drawing. Don't do that, obviously, but you could. And the idea is that this leader is taking you back to this center point of this dimension string. So I'll leave that there so we can see the differences in the type properties. So at this point I can change that from an arc to a line. Very simple, it's just straight. And at this point, once I change it to a line, I can give that shoulder length a different value. And the shoulder is just that dimension from the end of the text to where that line angles. You see I changed that to a 16th and the line angles. I'll change this back to an arc, hit apply, and you can see that's kind of the default. The leader tick mark, that's set at none. The tick mark being what is appearing there at the end of the leader line to the dimension string. Currently it's set at none. You could set all of these different values. You could make this an arrow if you want. If I hit apply, you can see that arrow shows up, and that arrow will move based on where I move the dimension string. You can make it absolutely anything you want. I typically don't use any because that's a default. Show leader when text moves, and the default option is away from origin. So the origin of this text or this dimension is that center. So if I choose beyond witness lines and hit apply, then at this point, because this dimension, or this, it is technically a dimension, the text for the dimension falls between these two witness lines for the dimension itself, the leader won't show up at all, which is, not a big deal, which basically says I can move this all the way over here and I'm not going to get a leader. That's kind of nice. But I will get a leader the second I move the edge of the text outside of this witness line. So that's kind of nice, but I would say it's situational. I'll go back to the type. I will change that back to default, away from origin. Now the tick mark is this tick over here, and it's set at a diagonal 1/8 of an inch. I can change this to absolutely anything to make it look how I want. I can make that a dot. Again, this can get kind of crazy. You can make these look however you want and customize them, but I typically like to leave these at default just because this is what everyone expects to see. Again, you can change the line weight of these different things. I can't say there's a real reason to. Again, I kind of like the way it's set up just from a default standpoint. There's not a lot that you need to change. The tick mark, you can change that to a different line weight if you want. See, that gets crazy real quick. Dimension line extension. So the dimension line extension, currently set at 330 seconds, is the extension beyond the dimension itself. So it's going to be that portion there, and you'll see it on both ends. So it's at 330 seconds. To make this a little more drastic, I'll change this at a 1/2 inch so you can see the difference. There's that extension of 1/2 inch extending from the edge. Change this back to 330 seconds. Hit apply, and witness line extension, same kind of thing, but from the witness line itself, it's going to be the extension from the top side. Again, I'll change this to a 1/2 inch. Let's see what that looks like. Turns out you can't change it to 1/2 foot. That's probably for the best. 1/2 inch right there. I'll put that back at 330 seconds. Hit apply. Witness line tick mark. Again, all kinds of tick marks are the same ones. You can apply them anywhere. It's just saying, hey, that's where the witness line is pointing to, this specific place, that specific place. You can go as crazy with it as you want, but typically it's not quite necessary. Center line is kind of nice. If I were you, I'd probably say if you're going to use the center line, which I do recommend using, you might change the size, because the default is it's too much. It's overbearing and it takes up a lot of space. So if I change this center line symbol to center line, imagine that, I hit apply, I can see that every witness line that falls within the center line of a wall, a door, an element, something, is going to get this CL here. Now this looks perfect until you start stacking dimensions on top of each other, and then the center line is in the way of witness lines and it's hard to read. That's why I'd make it smaller. I've seen others bold it, make it red, move it off to the side, dash it, whatever it is, just to give it a bit different look. Again, we've got center line tick mark. This is specific to center lines, so be aware of that. This is because these are showing up as center lines, they're actually impacting the dimension strings. Again, it's not a big deal to change this. You kind of want it at the default, in my opinion, because you want these things to look consistent, but just the center line itself tells you everything you really need to know about that particular witness line. Interior tick mark display. This is set to dynamic normally, and if I change this to always show, I can see now that I'm always going to see that interior tick mark. And that's just based on the interior tick marks. And that is based on the now usable interior tick mark set right here. I can put that I can make that anything I want again, apply it right there, and that's interior tick marks. Typically, I don't need to show those, so I keep it on dynamic, and honestly, dynamic doesn't show them either, so that's typically how I run with that. The ordinate dimension setting, I don't believe is usable until you The ordinate dimension setting is only usable if you change the dimension string type, the very first property, to ordinate. Now at this point, you saw what we had in the beginning. I'll hit apply. We can see where all these dimensions are now 0, and then it's basically adding up the length. Ordinate dimension settings, if I hit edit, I have text orientation. I can use parallel to the dimension line, which currently is, or the witness line. If I hit apply, it's going to just invert everything as to make it perpendicular now to the dimension and parallel to the witness. But that's a bit ridiculous, so I'll turn that back. The origin visibility, I can put that at none, so basically this 0 becomes not anything, which is, it's 0. The start is 0, so maybe that's what you want to run with if you're using this. The dimension style is, you probably want continuous, so you can add these things up. That's kind of the point. The text position is nice. You can have it just at the end of the witness line, or you could have it at the next one. If I hit that, I can see now it's at the end of every one, and because I've moved this one, this should actually be there. But now it's centered on the end as opposed to centered on the next one, which is, or before the next one. If I put that back at the next one, I can see it is on the left or on the before side of the witness line. And length of segments, that's set at default. The origin visibility there, I can see, I don't need to see that normally, but witness line only. Then I have the option of changing that specific origin tick mark. Again, this can get absolutely crazy. You can customize this to the end of the earth if you want to, but I'll put it back in continuous so we're all familiar with this a little more. I'll finally get down to color. Again, this is very simple as color. You can make this a giant red text if you want. Because this one's selected, I'm not seeing that as blue, or I am seeing this as blue, I'm not seeing it as red. I'll put this back at default black. Dimension line snap distance. This is really nice, really helpful. And make sure you set this because it's going to be something you want to set up in the beginning. So it's set at 1/8, and currently, really what this dimension line snap distance does is basically if you have more than one dimension stacked on top of each other, it's going to snap them an equal distance apart from each other. It's very nice. You want to set that here. But something I've noticed is it will not begin to take into account if it basically will not work if the length that you've set is not greater than the text height, and at least the text height, and I would say more than the text height, because you don't want these things like literally stacked on top of each other. So right now my text size is 3/32. So clearly 1/8 is enough, but I might want to go a little more because you're going to get these things on top of each other. So I'm going to make this 1/4 of an inch. I'll hit OK. You can see nothing happens, so I'm going to drag these out. And you can see as I begin to move this, I'll zoom in a bit, and once I move this closer, I actually get this nice snap right there. There's that snap. And so basically it's saying that the distance between these witness lines, the dimension string there, and this dimension string is going to be 1/4 of an inch. And that's nice. I'm actually going to change the value here of that back to 3/32 so it's not so crazy looking. Things look more consistent there. So this distance here is going to be 1/4 of an inch right there to there. That's going to be 1/4 inch in paper world. And again, if I drag this dimension string up, I get that 1/4 inch, and you can see that it's working because as soon as I drag it up, I can see that I get these different dashes saying that it's aligned, it's going to snap, and it's perfect. So now there's a good example of the center line not playing well, to put it lightly. The center line tick mark, the center line label and symbol itself is in the way. This is why I don't like it. So I would adjust it specifically how you want to see it, because this is not quite helpful. It just kind of looks like a mess there, even though it's trying to say that you're pointing to a center point there. Again, if I select this, go back to the type, scroll down, I've got text width factor. It is exactly what it is. If I change this to half, the width of the text is going to be half. I don't typically change that because I'm not trying to change the way the text looks. Again, you can underline, bold, and italic all these texts if you want to make it look specific for some reason. I don't typically need to do that. Maybe I underline something, maybe not. I might bold something for some sort of schematic presentation. Text size, it's pretty simple. Text is going to get larger every 30 seconds. Get that back to where it was. Text offset, it's just the offset of the text from the dimension string. If I put this at a 1/4, you'll see all the text jump up. Just like that. That's basically the default location for the text. I like to keep that pretty close to the line itself so it's easier to understand and see. The read convention. It's kind of confusing, but the default there is up, which is nice. And this really only applies whenever you have angled dimensions, something that's not, straight up and down or straight left and right. But what this is basically saying is, how am I going to read this angled text? Am I going to read it first, looking up and then looking right or left or whatever dimension? So to display this now, I will change this from up and right to left then up. And I'll hit apply, and you can see that this flips. It's kind of hard to understand this, but it's basically saying I'm going to read the text looking left and then up. I can't imagine a world that you'd want to do this unless you're trying to track dimensions around a building or something like this, but you can see as I change the angle that this dimension string, it's going to end up following it. And that's nice, but it doesn't necessarily always keep it readable in my mind. I want to change this back to the default. I need to actually select the text or the dimension, imagine that. I'll change this back to up and to the right. I'll hit OK. And now, because this is default is up, and it's greater than 0 degrees in this case, I can see the text normally. But you can see as I make this angle drastic and different over here, that dimension is going to stay on top and readable and let's say normal looking. So I can't say that I've really ever needed to change that, because I really by default want most of my dimensions to be readable. I want all my dimensions to be readable. So once again, I'll select this, go back into the type, scroll down here. You can change the text font to any of these different fonts that you have on your PC. Text background, opaque versus transparent. So by default, it's opaque. And if I drag this text, or if I drag this dimension to where the text is over this wall, I can't see the wall that is behind the text because it's set at opaque. I will edit the type, change that from opaque to transparent. As soon as I do that, I can see that wall behind the text because it's transparent. I'm not having this opaque white box essentially around the type, the text there. Put that back at opaque, hit apply. Unit formats. This is something that you'd want to set in your project for your dimensions especially, but by default it will use project settings. So a lot of times you might see these different dimensions that are set at, for this, in this case, 32nd inch. Like, is that helpful? Are people going to be measuring to a 32nd of an inch? Most of the time not, like really not. So generally basic tolerances are about 1/8 of an inch. Like you're not going to get more precise than that unless you specifically call out for that. So what I might want to do in this case is, for this particular dimension, is not necessarily use the default, rounding. So I probably want to use an eighth. Like, I want this to be an eighth. I want all of these dimensions to show up as an eighth, so it's understood that you clearly are, you're not trying to worry about getting things down to a 32nd of an inch. It's just crazy. You can choose to suppress zeros or suppress 0 feet. I can't say that I've ever done that. You could show a plus sign for positive values. I don't know why you need to do that. Use digit grouping. I've in suppress spaces, it's just going to compress things. I haven't used these really ever. The units here, you can change these units to anything. Generally, where I'm working, it's feet and fractional inches because I need to know what those are. But maybe it's a specific plan or a schematic design presentation or something where you want to see different units. This is where you do it for the dimension. So that's fine. All I need to do is change this to an eighth. I'll hit OK and apply. You can see that that's rounded to an eighth. In this case, it's closer to a fourth, so that's why I get it as a fourth. Very nice. Alternate units. Again, that's the same thing that we just went through. You can choose to show them or not. You can have them on the right or the left. It doesn't matter. And the alternate units are right below. And I have the same options, but in this case, they're set to, I think, millimeters by default. If I hit apply, I could see I've set the alternate units on the right, which is the right of all the dimensions, and it's showing the millimeters. Now maybe I want to show this in, I'll just say decimal feet, and I'll put that at 1 decimal place. And I'll hit apply, and I can see that that has been rounded to 0 or 37 feet, and I no longer have that quarter inch because it's rounding, and I have that 0.0 because I have set it at 1 decimal place. Again, you could get as crazy with this as you want. I honestly can't say I've ever used the alternate units, but I can see where it might come in handy if you're looking for something specific and you want to show multiple units. I'll hit apply, turn those off. Again, you can apply, I'll turn them back on actually, because we've got a prefix and a suffix that we can apply to that. So I'll put pre here, I'll hit apply, and all we see pre, and it's basically showing up before the alternate units. And I'll put a space, and I'll do suffix, and I'll hit apply, and you can see I've got prefix, number, suffix. It all works just like that. As soon as I hit none, all of those go away. Show opening height. I'll show that in just a second, so I'm going to skip that. Suppress spaces, again, if you're trying to compress spaces there and you have a bunch of different text and it's going across multiple text, you can suppress the spaces. I've really never done that. This is important, the equality text. So if I exit out of this and I look at this dimension string here, I'll drag this out, I could see that this EQ is currently set. And because I've clicked that, I can basically toggle the dimension equality. I can choose to see the dimensions or just click that and that they'll become equal. And so what does that really mean? In this case, this dimension string is actually showing 2 equal dimensions. So what I were to do is I'm just going to draw a basic line, a detail line. I'm going to draw it right there. And I'm going to create an align dimension that spans from the finish to the finish, and I'll go to that line there that I just drew. And now you can see the EQ is crossed out, which is basically telling me that these 2 dimensions are actually all strings in this entire dimension string are not equal. And that's clear because I can see these dimensions are not equal, but what I can do is I can press equal, and now not only is it going to make these show up as EQ, hinting at equal and showing equality, but that is no longer crossed out. It's showing me that it is equal, and the dimension between the finish and the line is also equal. That's all equal. But the thing to note is that the line was actually moved to create this equal condition. And if I were to uncheck that, now the line is still in the same place, and these dimensions are actually the same, 3, 9, 5/8 in this case. That's a great way to quickly align something in the center, because you could quickly do that and then just delete the dimension now that this line is in the center. very quickly do that. I think we're almost done. We're actually almost done. Again, equality text, you can change that to wherever you want. You can make it spell out equal. I don't know why you'd want to do that, but it'll change it to equal there. Equal. Default is EQ. It makes sense. Everyone knows what that means. Equality formula, the total length. You don't need to mess with this at all because it's calculating that total length in and making everything equal for you. You can add these different dimension parameters to the label itself if you wanted to. I've never messed with that. I don't think you need to. The equality witness display, which are these witness lines there. Tick and line, you could do a tick only or hide them completely. I want them to show up like everything else, so I want the equality witness display to show up like everything else because it's just another dimension. It's just showing up all the same. I'll draw another line, and actually I'll draw a couple of lines here and make them random. I will make an align from this finish wall to that line, that line, that line, and the finish there. And again, I have the option of choosing equal. And if I do that, these lines are all going to move. They'll all move to where the segment length between this wall and the first line is going to be equal to all of them. So when I do that, I get this equality, and all the lines are moved. And this actually works with walls. This is very powerful. I take the center line of that wall, the center line of this wall, and the center line of this wall in the center there. You can see I have center line, but if I choose equality, that entire wall is going to move, and I now have these two equal portions. It's a very helpful and very quick way of moving things, and if you know they need to be equal. I use that all the time with RCP plans where I need lights to be centered in spaces or between walls or whatever it might be. All of that is the aligned and linear type properties. You can make as many different types as you want because you probably want them if you want different properties. I think Revit's got plenty in here by default, and it's all the different properties we looked at. You can change one thing. Please, if you're changing these things, definitely rename them to what you changed. So in this case, the type is called 3/32 linear because it's basically out of the box, unchanged in default. If I were to change something like this tick mark, I might change the tick mark to dot filled. So I'd probably call this linear 3/32 inch dash dot filled. Tick mark dot filled, something like that. Just to infer that this is different and what changed, but of course you don't have to do that. Revit's not going to make you do that, but just for clarity's sake and for other people working, please be aware of that and definitely try and do that. So let's look into overrides here. Right before I get into the different types, I'll look into the overrides. I've got this dimension here, and any dimension I can click on, and I've got some properties that I can change. It's like an override by element, I guess you could say. So I could use the actual value, which this is what you're going to get out of the box. You can click that. It's going to show you the actual value, but you can actually replace that with text. So I'll just type out text again. I'll hit apply, and it's text. It doesn't matter what the dimension value is. You've changed it to text. Not a big deal. I've never used any labels. I honestly wouldn't mess with it. If you have had success with showing labels in view on these dimensions, please let me know in the comments below. I'm really curious. You have an above option, so I'll type in up, hit apply. You can see that text is above in this case, and a below. Type in down, and we've got down. This is going to show up below the dimension string by default. And just like before, we have the option to add a prefix and suffix, but I only have that option if I'm using the actual value. So in this case, if I hit apply, I've got that actual value. I've got information above and below, and I could type in pre and then suffix here, and I get all of that information showing up on either side of the dimension. So this is, each one of these dimensions can get crazy. You could overload this with a lot of information, and maybe you want to make this a note. A lot of times I've used these different values for dimensioning stairs, where you want to say you've got 4 treads at 11 inches, it's 44 inches, whatever it is. That's what you can put all this information in the text itself. So that's how I've used specific overrides for these texts. So let's now look at the align. I will say 9 times out of 10, and probably even more than that, I'm using the aligned. And what is the align? The aligned is saying I want to determine a starting point, and the dimension will forever be aligned to that starting point. So if I start on the center line of this wall, every dimension string that I have access to at this point will be dimensioned to that plane. So it's looking at this vertical plane, and everything else that I click will be within that vertical plane. I don't have a choice because I've started the string at that point. Likewise, if I start on the finish and I press tab, I think that you've set the default of placing dimensions on wall center lines. You can make this wall core, whatever, faces of the core. Anyways, that's not a big deal because you actually have the option to tab to different pieces of the wall. So right now I've got all these different parts within the wall. You can tab to any of them. You don't necessarily need to change this to a specific value. It's not a huge deal. You can also choose entire walls, which I can't say I've ever used, but I can choose this entire wall, and now I'm starting this dimension like that. I'm choosing this dimension. I'm basically choosing entire walls that I'm dimensioning to. I think that's kind of a mess, and it can get kind of weird to understand what's happening. But some of the options I have are whether I'm dealing with openings or not. Those could be the centers, the widths, whatever, intersecting. You could deal with this in a different way through those options. But again, I like to use the individual reference because I want to be specific with dimensions most of the time. So I'll choose. So again, if I choose the finish of this wall, I'm now restricted to this vertical face. It's basically perpendicular to the face of the dimension or the wall or whatever it might be that you've started. So you're stuck with perpendicular to that. And likewise, if I choose the center line of this wall, now I am stuck with any dimension that is perpendicular to the direction of this wall. That's how and when you would use the align tool, the align dimension tool. And you can go pretty crazy with this because I can even select the corner of that wall and get dimensions like that because this is still within the perpendicular plane of this wall. Just it is. So that's the align. I'm going to use that most of the time for all my exterior dimensions, anything that's long and running. But there's linear. Linear looks to be the same, and 9 times out of 10 it's going to function the same. But the thing that's different about linear is how it performs in this case angles. But just for an example, I'm not getting any like highlighted options over here. Like there's not anywhere that I can select because I can even click here and I don't see anything. But once I zoom in here, the ends of walls now become available. I've got all these points showing up. So let's say I choose, and I know you can't see it, but I can choose this point, and I can choose the point. I can also choose the end of this point. So something to be aware of with linear dimensions that is not with aligned. The difference between them is that linear dimensions are restricted to appearing and functioning only horizontal or vertical. So right now, I've chosen this point there and this point there, and as I move this dimension out in one direction or the other, you can see that dimension is always vertical or horizontal. But I'm still getting this weird dimension that in some cases I do want and I would probably need in this case if this is supposed to be something specific, of course. So a lot of times I would use this if I have weird angled walls that I need to get definitely horizontal or vertical dimension, because again, I can't make this an angle. No matter what I do, where I place this, I can't get an angle of if I'm using the linear dimension tool. I can select that point there and this point there, and I'm stuck with this linear dimension function, only vertical and horizontal. So that's something to be aware of it too. And finally, angle. Angle is probably the easiest of these three that we've talked about. All I'm prompted to do is select walls, and I can choose the wall center line. Again, I can tab to any place in the wall. It's not a big deal. But because it's an angle, it's really not a huge deal. So I can select this wall, that wall, and I can see I've got 90 degrees. I can drag this all the way around, and again, I still have the 90 degrees. If I select this wall, select that wall, I've got the 45 degrees. And as soon as I drag this up there, I've got 135 degrees. And again, I can see 135 degrees there, 45 degrees there, because I'm still referencing those two walls that I've selected. I'll go ahead and leave this here, 45 degrees. And let's make a linear dimension like we had before. I'll choose that point, and now let's look at the properties for angled. It's not going to be as long as linear dimensions because everything is basically the same. Everything all the way through here is the exact same. There's actually less to deal with. It's really all the same. I'm not even going to say anything about it. It's always the same. You don't need to worry about it. Obviously, you can make these different, and maybe you want to do something specific with angles versus linear dimensions. You probably do, but really there's nothing that you need to be aware about that I didn't already cover in the linear dimensions. One last thing I'd like to show is the show opening height in the linear dimension types. Show opening height right there. If I check that, it will actually show me the height of a window or an opening that I have. So let's draw a window. If I hit window, and I'll go ahead and use a 3x6 window, just so we know that. It'll be a 3x6 window. Let's go ahead back to annotate, align, and I will draw a dimension from the outside face to the edge of the window, another edge of the window. I can see that there's my 3-foot window. Now I'll go back to the type properties and I will check show opening height, and as soon as I hit apply, you could see that this 6-foot value, which is the opening height of that window, appears below. And that's really helpful if you have a lot of different openings of different heights that are around your building. I can't say that I've used that before, but I would use that in a circumstance where maybe it's a one single level building and I've got different heights of openings throughout, or maybe I have so many different, maybe I have the same type window in a million different places throughout the project where I'm not going to elevate those windows to give it a height in elevation, and I just simply say it's this type of window and there's the height and width right there. I don't need to do anything else. That's probably where I would use it, but again, I haven't really needed to use that quite yet. That will be part 1 of dimensions, where we've covered the aligned, linear, and angled dimension. We've covered all the type properties for all three because they're essentially the same. It was quite long, I do apologize, but I hope you have a better understanding of all the different possibilities and combinations that you can use dimensions for, and how they can function to appropriately dimension what you need to in your project. Please, if you liked this video, demolish that like button. It really helps. Also subscribe if you enjoyed this video. There will be a lot more coming out like this. I obviously have part 2 and part 3 of dimensions, so I really get ramped up about that because dimensions, the best thing in Revit, clearly. Anyways, thank you guys for watching. Hope to see you in part 2 and 3 of dimensions. Hope you have a wonderful day, and thanks for watching.